Think we're live? We're live now. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to introduce you to this week's LJY Torah Bonanza. I am an LJY Boger, Gideon, and I'm delighted to have with me LJY stalwart, student Rabbi Gabriel. Gabriel, do you want to introduce yourself briefly and also tell us what this week's parasha is about?
Hello, I'm Gabriel. I am a student rabbi, which means I'm training to become a rabbi. I'm 3 years in, 2 years to go, so I've just passed halfway. And back in the olden days, I was a mowo, and before that, I was a rosh, and before that, I was a madrich. And at the very beginning of that, I think I had Gideon in a dorm in Plugim, which seems like quite a long time ago. But it's lovely to be back with LJY-Netzer, and particularly for a parasha, which has got some interesting things going on in it. This week's parasha is called Devarim, which means things, and it's the first section of the book of Deuteronomy. And so just like I'm more than halfway through my training, we're now well over halfway through the Torah. This is the beginning of the final book. And it's all beginning to feel a bit repetitive, because there's lots and lots of things that have happened already being kind of described again. And you know, sometimes in a film you have a flashback sequence. You'll have something being shown that happened in the past and isn't actually happening then. Well, it's not like that at all. Because when it happens in a film, they're showing you something you didn't see before. They might be showing you how the crime was committed or how two people met or something like that, and it's filling in a gap. This isn't filling in a gap because we've read all the stories that are being retold to us. And so it's a bit more like edited highlights, almost. It's kind of like the best of books 1 to 4 are being put at the beginning of book 5. And they're actually very edited. It's not really quite the way it happened the first time round. And so what's going on there? We're being told this edited version of the story by Moses. Most of the last book of the Torah really is Moses giving a big long final speech telling the whole story. And he's telling it very much in his own words, and he's changing quite a lot of the details. And one of the biggest details he's changing is he's changing who gets the blame for things. So about 6 or 7 weeks ago, we were in a parasha about spies making their way into the promised land to see what it was like. And they came back and they said, oh, it's terrifying, there's giants, you don't want to go there. When Moses is telling this story, though, he doesn't mention the spies at all. He just says, you, the people. He's blaming everything on everyone collectively. He's saying, you were too scaredy cat to go into the land, you rebelled, you said you didn't want to go there. Why is he making it all about the you? We don't really know, and it's an interesting one. And probably it was about him trying to pass off his own responsibility, because he's looking back at his life and his career, and he doesn't want to think about the failures that he had. He doesn't want to think about how he appointed 12 people who weren't very good at their jobs and who gave up too easily. He wants to pass the buck a little bit. And I think maybe we need to be a bit sympathetic, because this is someone who knows that they're dying and they're about to pass the buck, and we understand that because they're looking back at their life in very rose-tinted glasses, like we might expect. But there's something real that happens as well. There's one real thing that happens, and that is Moses appoints some more people. The 12 spies he appointed didn't end well, and so he appoints well over 12 people now. He appoints people to lead different levels of the Israelite community. So he appoints people to be in charge of each of the tribes. There were 12 tribes. And then he divides the tribes into 2 halves, and he appoints a slightly more junior leader to look after each of those 2 halves. And then he splits the halves into smaller bits and smaller bits. And eventually he had so many leaders. He had leaders who were in charge of just 10 people, and they would answer to a leader who is in charge of 50 people, and they'd answer to a leader who's in charge of 100 people. All the way going up, all the way through the ranks. And that's the one real thing that actually happens here.
That's really interesting. Thank you for telling us that. On that last point about leadership, obviously LJY is a movement which works where there are different structures of leadership and leadership happens on different levels. I was just wondering how that story of leadership and delegating responsibility and how people move up through the ranks, how you think that relates to youth empowerment and collective leadership within LJY-Netzer.
Yeah, it's really like LJY. This is what I think every time I read this parasha, and it's partly like LJY because they're all living in tents and it's a camp and it feels very Kadima like in its own way. But also because we've got those different levels of leadership. Just like on Kadima, we have Madrachim, who are responsible for a small number of people, and then you've got a Rosh, who's responsible for a bigger number of people, but also has to look after the Madrachim. And then you have a movement worker who has more people. This is the same structure that they had in the desert. And I think there's two reasons why that was really important, and both of those reasons apply to LJY-Netzer as well. The first one is it's about looking after people's well-being. And there was no way Moses could have run this whole show by himself. It would be impossible. In the same way, there's no way a Rosh could run the whole of Nechalim by themselves. It's impossible. And actually sharing the burden and having people to look after you and make sure that someone's telling you to take a bit of time off or not to worry about every little detail is a really important way of guarding people's well-being. And the other reason is about education. And this is where the idea of youth empowerment comes in, which is no one can go from being just an ordinary Israelite to being Moses overnight. And so you actually have to create this sort of staged pathway where people get more and more responsibility and more experience until they're ready to be the most senior leaders that there are. And that's also what happens in LJY. Once upon a time, Gideon, you were in a plug-in dorm. And then I watched you gradually becoming a leader, becoming a Rosh. There's all the different journey that you went on. And that's what all of us went on. And that's how leadership develops.
That's great. It's good to know that the dynamics of LJY's leadership goes back thousands of years. So aside from that, and aside from the leadership aspect, what are some of the other lessons we can learn from this parasha? How can we learn, some of the lessons that are written for LJY today, for our movement, for society, and for us as individuals?
So there's one slightly odd verse. Well, there's quite a lot of slightly odd verses, but there's one in particular that really caught my attention when I was reading through it. And it's Moses saying to the Israelites, "Your little ones, your children who you said would be carried off by the enemy, your children who do not know good from evil, they will enter into the promised land." Now, whenever you see any references to children, it's always a good idea to look into them because there's normally something interesting behind it. And that includes this one. What does it mean to not know the difference between good and evil? And is it a good thing or not to know that difference? Is it actually a benefit to the person? Because Moses seems to be saying it is. Moses seems to be saying it's the children who don't know the difference between good and evil who are going to go into the promised land and get the milk and the honey and the falafel and the rest of it. And what exactly do we mean by that? So I looked to see what other rabbis have said about it. And there was a rabbi called Samuel Luzzatto, who sounds like a type of pizza, but I think they're just an Italian rabbi. And they lived about 100 years ago. And they said that this was writing about children who were under the age of 20, not necessarily children then, people under the age of 20, and they had no say in the running of the community because no one listened to them. But that didn't mean that they weren't wise people and that there weren't some of them who were worth listening to. And I think that's a really important message for LJY-Netzer as well. LJY also consists of people who are mainly children. Some people are over 18, but some people are under 18. And the people who are under 18 in particular quite often don't get listened to in the same way as everyone else. They don't have a vote. They don't get to dictate the way their school runs or their college runs. But just because they're not being listened to doesn't mean they have nothing to say. And just because they don't have an official say and they don't officially get to vote or have any input doesn't mean that you shouldn't listen to them anyway and take some ideas on board. And actually, I think there's a subtext to what Samuel Luzzatto was saying, and that's maybe that adults mess things up. I think he might have been suggesting that actually all these wrong bits of wrongdoing that Moses was complaining about, and the being scared and the lying and the pretending there were giants, these were all things that the grown-ups did. And there was a generation of children sitting there who weren't really taking part in this and weren't being listened to, but maybe they wouldn't have made those same mistakes. And so the idea that we need fresh young people who've not been hurt by the years of experience of what it's like to be an adult, who haven't had to hang on to council helplines or build things or worry about tax and worry about the pressures of the grown-up world. Actually, maybe it's young idealistic people who should be building the future and who should be building our new society. And I think that's probably our main lesson for LJY-Netzer from this parasha.
Thank you. That is a really empowering and inspiring message. I'd like to thank you for being with us today and telling us about this really, really interesting parasha and for being part of a really great discussion. LJY will be doing this 10 minutes of Torah every week, and we really hope you can join us next week. Thank you very much to Rabbi Gabriel, and thank you very much for watching.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.